Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Ebola, the social and the economic cost. We're on the ground in Liberia with the burial teams and in studio with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa for an exclusive interview. Also this week, Asia in focus, from the US pivot to China's response as it plans to spend billions reviving an economic corridor along the old Silk Road. So a big focus on Ebola this week, particularly a new report from the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, which appears to say, hold on, perhaps at least the economic impact of this won't be as bad as originally thought. We'll look more at that later in our interview with Carlos Lopes, who is the head of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. But first, some numbers. Now, you may remember the World Bank estimated the impact on West Africa would be about $33 billion. Then the UN asked for almost $1 billion for Guinea, Liberia and Sierra Leone. Of that, it's only received 63%, about $623 million, which has been distributed like this: $73 million for Guinea, $343 million for Liberia and $127 million for Sierra Leone. But of course, donations only go so far. All three nations have been forced to slash their growth projections for 2014. And you look at that there, we really do mean slash. They have been cut right back in anticipation of what Ebola and its knock-on effects could do. And before we get further into the numbers, it is always important to hear the human story, and not just the sick and the dying, but those putting themselves into harm's way to help those people. Al Jazeera joined a burial team in Liberia, underpaid, tasked with the most grim of tasks, but still doing it. Banu Batnaga has their story.
A group prayer before they begin another difficult day. This Red Cross burial team, based in the Liberian capital Monrovia, has been called to a house in the outskirts of the city. The body of a young man called Robert has been left in an outhouse.
Those that are picking the bodies, we are also very concerned about them, that if you don't follow the protocol properly, you could be infected and yourself could be a victim of the situation.
The World Health Organization says around 500 trained burial teams are needed to bring the Ebola epidemic under control. But in the three worst hit countries, there are only 140. And many of those doing the difficult and dangerous job are volunteers. Salom Karwa has recovered from Ebola. She now works as a volunteer, helping to care for the sick.
Ebola, if you have it, you feel like it's a sickness from another planet, because it has 100% severe pain from head to toes. You can even feel the pain in the marrow of your bones. The family just come and come.
So far, more than 300 health workers in Liberia have caught the Ebola virus.
Our own disappointment as health workers, WHO brought a staff that are paying 200, 300 per hour. Then we that are doing the dirty work, we are paid 300 for what? For monthly.
In one of Monrovia's most densely populated areas, a man is spotted hiding on a rooftop. Fear is running high, and his neighbors say they suspect he has Ebola.
The young man was sitting down, vomiting from this morning. All the people came in that if this man stay here, Ebola people come, they will burn him, they will kill him, all of our fears.
The man agrees to come with health workers to the hospital. There are signs the number of new cases of Ebola in Liberia might be going down. But experts say it's just too early to say whether progress has been made or if the worst is still to come.
And it may well be, or at the very least, what we have here is a very open-ended crisis. And so to our feature interview with a man tasked with figuring out how bad this could get and what the social and economic impact will be. He is Carlos Lopes, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, who joined us here in Doha for an exclusive interview.
Well, I've been there twice, and I think in the region. I think, of course, it's dramatic. You have about 13,000 cases of people infected. You have about close to 5,000 people that have already died. And obviously, the numbers are quite dramatic. But if you compare them with other diseases of the same type, epidemiological diseases. Like, for instance, right now we don't talk anymore about SARS, we don't talk about HN1, we don't talk about tuberculosis, we don't talk about many other diseases that kill much more people and are much more infectious. So that is the medical part.
Okay.
On the economic side, it's also quite dramatic because these three countries were doing rather well. In fact, they were in the top tier in terms of performance, and all of a sudden, it's a very difficult situation because of all the consequences coming from Ebola. And I think, you have different predictions. The predictions from the countries themselves, none go close to zero growth. They still have a little growth.
Yeah.
But if we were to actually look into a zero growth scenario for both 2014 and 2015, we'll be talking about something in the range of 0.05% of Africa's combined GDP being affected, which is almost nothing. It's a thin air in terms of economic impact for the region.
For West Africa?
For the region, all of Africa. If it is, if we are talking about West Africa, it's slightly higher, but we are talking about 1.9% impact.
Okay, so you're saying that the economic impact isn't as dramatic, and yet, I mean, other organisations, the World Bank has been talking about a lot, sort of, I'm not going to say doomsday scenario, but a lot worse than that. Well, where's the discrepancy there?
Well, what the World Bank is doing is basically looking into three scenarios. And of course, if you look into the worst case scenario, they are saying it can have an effect of about 32 billion. But they are not saying it's about the impact of these three countries in the economy of the continent, but rather the perception impact. You know, the panic, hysteria, stigma can provoke incredible damage. They have done that so many times in the past. And, you know, you create this situation where it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you say it's so bad, it's going to happen.
Yeah, but it's also prudent to go to that worst-case scenario because we are dealing with an open-ended crisis here. There is no end in sight. There's no end date on it. We haven't realised this could get a lot worse yet. So maybe it's prudent to be thinking along those lines as well.
You see, when you have a situation of emergency, think about the tsunami. You always have this contradiction or paradox. On one hand, of course, you want to mobilize international response. You want people to give more money. You want resource mobilization drive to be the catalyst for so many transformations for the long run. On the other hand, you may incur into exaggeration. And the exaggeration in itself provokes a lot of problems. You see, in Africa right now, you know, we are dealing with the stigma that is growing by the day. And this is going to affect economies that have nothing, absolutely nothing to do with Ebola. So the 32 billion scenario, just for the people to realize, is almost 4 times the size of the economy of these three countries. So even if these countries just disappeared, hypothetically or theoretically, it would not have been as bad. And yet, you know, we are talking about these numbers because of the stigma and the consequences of perception.
You mentioned international reaction, mobilizing international funds. How strong has it been? Because what we always get in these situations is lots of promises, but not necessarily fulfilled.
Well, if we look into the pledges that have been announced by the key players in this game, we are talking about $3.2 billion already announced.
Pledged.
But then when you look into the ground, and you know, we have been talking to the leaders of these three countries, you don't see even close to that. I think we are right now at about 15 to 20% of actually disbursements taking place on the ground. It's obvious that part of this money that has been pledged is actually to support the interventions themselves of the countries. So they are not going to give this money to the affected countries, but rather send medical units. And like, for instance, the UN has done about 500 flights.
Right, so it takes on different forms. It's not just, here, take the money.
Still, 15% is quite low.
So what to do about that? Do you just pressure countries to come good on what they've promised?
Absolutely, and not only pressure in terms of making sure that the pledges are transformed into real disbursements, but also to make sure that the countries have some role to play on this. Because you see, if we have all these very strong, well-orchestrated interventions that are going to last only for a few months, and then everybody basically goes home the moment the numbers start to drop, you are not going to really deal with the issue, because in every single country you had an outbreak, and we are dealing with outbreak number 14. So this is not new. Every single country that had an outbreak, it comes back. And obviously it's not creating any panic or damage in Congo or in Uganda, because there is capacity to deal with it. So you always have very small numbers that have nothing to do with the kind of challenges that we have with other diseases. But what is it going to happen in Guinea, Sierra Leone and Liberia if we actually don't leave behind the capacity to deal with future outbreaks?
Overseas countries, the other thing they might do is want to spend money on beefing up their own defences. Now, you've made the point that, you know, Ebola is here and it's not through the rest of Africa, and there have been limited cases elsewhere. But again, does that fear factor prompt people to, or countries to put their money into their own resources and make sure that their defences are up? I mean, because look, it is a disease which can travel.
Well, let's be clear. It's a biosafety hazard. Ebola is one of the most deadly diseases. Not as much as people are actually thinking, but it is pretty bad. So therefore, you know, in every single army that really carries the name with pride, there is capability to deal with biohazards of this kind. This can be transformed into biological warfare. It can really go out of control. So you have to have the capacity and you have to have the response. So it is not a surprise that the type of interventions that are being offered to these countries have some military component, because that's where the research is and that's where the capabilities are. But let's be also frank, this response that is being tested in these three countries is also a way of, you know, testing the capabilities in case there is a bigger problem in the countries concerned. So I absolutely understand the need for a better coordinated response capacity being almost like the objective number one right now. And I think that is actually not only to the benefit of the three affected countries, but to the world.
Are there other parts of society in these countries which are breaking down as a result of Ebola? I mean, we've talked about healthcare issues. What about infrastructure? What about education? These sorts of things being affected by either the crisis or the stigma of the crisis?
Well, schools are closed. No kids in these three countries are going to school. You have a situation where manufacturing is very much affected by the lack of shipping lines wanting to service these countries. Agriculture, of course, is quite disrupted because the epicenter of the pandemic in the three countries is basically in the rural areas. You have a situation where the fiscal deficit is growing because obviously the countries are not collecting taxes. This is not the kind of preoccupation you have in a situation of this type. So you have really a situation where the capability of countries, fiscally speaking, is diminishing by the day. And the only way you can deal with it is by a stimulus. You need a financial package that will allow the economy basically to keep afloat.
Okay, so this makes me want to double back to what we said originally, because your original comments in this interview were about how the economic impact has been overstated and it's perhaps not as big, and yet everything you've just described is so fundamental. Agriculture, education, trade, these things are, you've just said, are being badly hit, but yet you still think the situation's been overstated?
No, I don't think it is overstated in terms of a problem. It's overstated in terms of the figures being mentioned. Because let's take the case of Liberia. Liberia is a country where 1/3 of its revenue comes from remittances. Are the remittances going to be affected? No, because, you know, the diaspora is actually sending more money.
More money
because of the result of the pandemic. Then you have the mining. Mining accounts for another 1/3. Mining, yes, it has diminished quite significantly, but it has not stopped. In fact, some of the mines are actually keeping their targets on track. What they are saying is that we are not going to invest new money until this thing is over. So you already have two elements that are contributing for most of the economy. So one thing is the economy, another thing is the social impact. The social impact is huge because people used to live with subsistence type of activities in agriculture and so on that are now heavily disrupted. So they are really in need for help. Some even in need for food aid because they just don't have the rice, stocks in Liberia, for instance, are depleted. And now it's 1 month instead of the 6 months they normally have. So yes, one thing is the economy, another thing is the social side. But what I think is frankly very exaggerated is not the situation of the three, but the situation in relation to the rest of Africa.
Sure. Dr. Lopes, it's been Fascinating talking to you. Very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And so we look to what might be, how countries will eventually recover from Ebola and its effects. Right now that focus is on Nigeria, which has been declared Ebola-free and where business confidence is returning gradually. This from Ahmed Idris.
Stocking up on supplies. For Patrick Eki, a dealer in sanitary and personal hygiene products, business has never been better. The outbreak of Ebola presented a massive opportunity for growth to his company and others like it. They're now struggling to keep up with demand.
Right now, there's a lot of awareness. People are now showing a lot of interest in their health. There's a lot of demand for the paper towels, a lot of demand for the hand sanitizers. Almost every day we have new customers coming in asking for, people making inquiries all over the place.
But at a market outside Lagos, Titilayo Amosu, a trader in textiles, is a worried woman. She's never seen anything like the past 3 months when Ebola was here. Her customers come from different West African countries. They're worried about the virus that killed more than 5,000 people across the region, at least 8 of them in Nigeria.
Because that time people were scared to come. People were afraid to come outside because they said through sweating you can contact it.
She hopes the gradual return to normalcy in markets in and around Nigeria's economic capital will rub off on her small store.
Confidence is returning to the Badagry international market. Here at the fish section, customers from Togo, Benin Republic, Ghana and even beyond have come to do business. But at the peak of the Ebola outbreak, many stayed away. But now traders are busy trying to recoup lost time and money.
Economists say the biggest impact of the disease on Nigeria's economy could lie outside the country's borders.
The economy of Nigeria affects all other countries on the sub-region, and a situation where you have 3 major countries, Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, being affected, and these are countries where Nigerians are major economic players.
Analysts say there are many investors who are still concerned about Ebola in West Africa, and such people are expected to stay away, at least for the near future. They warn that Nigeria's economy, which is by far the biggest, will not be safe from the impact of Ebola unless the virus is also contained everywhere in the region, which means optimism expressed by textile trader Titilayo Amosu of a brighter future may be premature.
And now in this part of the show, the geopolitical battle for Asia, particularly China, which has all sorts of overseas plans for growth. Now it's managing its slowdown at home. For one, it's been trying to attract APEC members to a new regional trading bloc after the US excluded it from its Trans-Pacific Partnership. But wider than that, Beijing plans to spend $1.25 trillion overseas over the next 10 years. And perhaps nothing underlines its ambition more than this. It is a plan to revive the old Silk Route, a rail line from inner China to Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and sea lines as well with that. Beijing has also established a $50 billion Asian infrastructure investment bank. And during the APEC summit near Beijing, China debuted its new stealth fighter, the J-31, at the Zhuhai Air Show. Just a little timely reminder about military strength too. Well, let's bring in Jonathan Fenby. He's the Managing Director of China Research at the consulting group Trusted Sources. Jonathan, good to have you with us. Can I just get a quick thought to start with on another China issue, and that is climate change, the deal it announced with the US. I mean, aside from the actual deal and the targets, the fact that the US are cooperating so much after the APEC summit, I mean, they were really playing nice, weren't they?
Yes, certainly on the environment, on the climate change, this is an important agreement if it is put into effect and implemented as set out. I mean, China has undertaken for the first time to cap emissions, but the date is 2030. So that's a long way ahead. There's a lot of water under the bridge before then. And in a sense, I mean, I don't want to downgrade this because it is very important. The environment is one of those issues on which Washington and Beijing can reach agreement, at least in principle, as to what they want to do. A lot of other issues which came up at the APEC summit and around it are much less easy and much somewhat shorter term, and therefore actually more difficult to make progress on.
OK then, let's pick up on one of those issues, the so-called TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which China has been excluded from. And yet President Obama is saying, you know, we're not trying to contain Beijing here. So why has it been left out?
Well, the rules set up for the TPP basically would exclude an economy like China's, where you have a lot of state intervention in the economy, a big public sector, a lot of controls, currency controls, controlled financial markets, and so on. So from those points of view, China has been excluded. Now, the Americans say this is because they want, as it were, like-minded nations to join to make the TPP into a success. If you're looking at it from China's point of view, of course, it's very easy to say, well, from the strategic point of view, here we've got a big American fleet in the south of Japan and the island chain running down from Okinawa, where that fleet is, through Taiwan to the Philippines. That strategically, in a sense, cuts off China on its eastern coast. And now we've got this trade deal, they might say, in which Washington is trying to line up a dozen other countries in an organization from which we'll be excluded, and which, according to some projections, could cost us up to $100 billion in trade each year. So you can see that China doesn't like the TPP. It sees it as a hostile element, and it wants a much easier, more relaxed free trade zone to come into being in the Pacific, in which it will be able to take place. So you've got definitely battle lines drawn on the trade front there.
OK, so we've talked about China and the US. There is China with the rest of the region. What about China on its own? I mean, it has got all this cash sitting there. What is it going to do with it? It talks about going on a spending spree of $1 trillion. What's it going to do?
It's going to, certainly there's going to be big outward investment. We've already seen that from China into, first of all, into resources in Africa, above all, but also in Latin America, also in Canada, in Australia, and elsewhere. Now China is moving into wanting to buy companies around the world, particularly in the West. For instance, in France, just this week, the top bidder for the airport outside the city of Bordeaux, which is being privatized, is a Chinese consortium. So, yes, the outward investment is going to continue and will be greater probably than investment into China over the coming years, but we're going to run into some political problems along the way.
And then this idea of reviving the old Silk Road, I mean, is that doable? What do you think?
The Silk Road it's a nice idea. To some extent, it is being put into place. For instance, China has moved into Central Asia in quite a big way. It has also developed, of course, what's called the Maritime Silk Road, which is ports all the way around to the Gulf to protect oil supplies, but also to have a Chinese presence there. But perhaps most interesting and most important in this has been the rapprochement between China and Russia, which we've seen this year, which was characterized in the huge gas deal that was done for supplies of Russian gas to China, and is now being followed by other projects, including a railway line from Western China through Central Asia and Russia to reach the North Sea, which will be much quicker and cheaper for exports than sending them by sea. China is projecting its power, is projecting its influence. Xi Jinping is arguably the most powerful leader on the planet at the moment, and he's not a man to adopt a low profile. The old saying used to be in China to hide your brilliance until the time comes to show it. And I think for Xi, the time has come to show it.
And that is our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/programs. The Counting the Cost page is there with individual reports, links and entire episodes to catch up on. Down the right-hand side as well as the social media feed, which has got people's comments and feedback. You can join that as well by tweeting either me, at Kamal AJE, or our business editor, at Abid Oliver Ali, and do use the hashtag Counting the Cost as well when you do. Or just drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.